They never knew that the man they laughed out of our kitchen would be the one holding my hand in the delivery room while my own mother screened my calls. The last time my father spoke to me as his daughter, he was standing in the foyer of our house in Greenwich, adjusting his cufflinks, telling me I was throwing away 3 generations of Whitmore lawyers for a man who, in his words, pours concrete for a living. His name was Theo. He didn't pour concrete. He was a welder, and a good one. The kind who got called in when a job mattered, when the cheap guys had already failed. But to my father, the distinction didn't exist. There was the world he respected, the one with diplomas on the wall and reserved parking spots downtown, and then there was everyone else. I was 22 when it happened. I want to be honest about that number because so much of how this gets told depends on it. Old enough to vote, to sign a lease, to make my own mistakes. Not old enough, apparently, to choose who I loved. I'd met Theo the summer before at my cousin's wedding of all places, where he'd been part of the crew that built the outdoor pavilion. He was leaning against his truck eating a sandwich while the rest of us pretended to enjoy a string quartet, and I sat down next to him because he looked like the only person there who wasn't performing. We talked for 2 hours. He told me about his mother, who'd raised 3 boys on a nurse's salary in Bridgeport. I told him about the law school applications sitting on my desk that I hadn't been able to open in weeks. He didn't tell me to push through. He just asked quietly, "Do you actually want to be a lawyer, or do you want them to stop asking?" Nobody had ever asked me that. Not once. We got married 11 months later at the courthouse on a Tuesday with his brothers and his mother, and exactly 0 people from my side. I sent the invitation anyway. I told myself I wasn't expecting anything, but I checked the mailbox every day for 2 weeks, like an idiot. My mother sent back a single line on cream-colored stationery. "When you're ready to be serious about your life, you know where we are." That was it. No name signed. As if I wouldn't recognize her handwriting. I was pregnant by then, which is the part everyone wants to make into the scandal. The truth is messier and more boring. We hadn't planned it. We weren't careful enough, and when the test came back positive, I cried in our tiny bathroom. Not because I was scared of the baby, but because I knew with total certainty what my father would say, and he said it. Word for word almost, that I was making myself unmarriageable to anyone of consequence. That a child would lock me into that man's world permanently. He actually used the phrase diluting the family. I remember staring at him and thinking, who talks like that about their own grandchild? So they cut me off. Not just emotionally. My father called the bank and removed me from the trust my grandmother had left, the one that was supposed to be mine at 25. He had the legal standing to do it technically because of how it was structured, and he made sure I knew he'd done it on purpose. The message was simple. Come back on our terms or have nothing. I had nothing, and I survived it. Those first years were the hardest of my life, and also, looking back, the ones I'm proudest of. Theo and I rented half a duplex outside New Haven. I waitressed until I was 8 months along, then I got a job doing medical billing for a clinic, which I could do from home once the baby came. Theo worked doubles. We had a budget written on a whiteboard on the fridge, and we celebrated when we could move $30 from the emergency column to the someday column. Our daughter, Margot, was born on a snowy March morning, and Theo cried so hard the nurse had to ask him to sit down. He named her after his grandmother, the one who'd come over from Portugal with nothing. I called my mother from the hospital. I don't know why. Hormones, exhaustion, some stubborn little girl hoped that a baby would crack something open in her. She let it go to voicemail. I left a message saying she had a granddaughter, 7 pounds 2 ounces, and that her name was Margot. She never called back. Theo found me crying over the phone an hour later, and he didn't say anything. He just took the phone out of my hand, set it face down on the table, and held me. Margot grew up not knowing she was supposed to be ashamed of her last name. She grew up thinking welders were heroes because hers came home smelling like metal and let her ride on his shoulders to the corner store. She grew up watching her father read 3 books a week from the public library because the man my parents dismissed as ignorant was the most curious person I have ever met. He taught himself Spanish from cassette tapes. He could explain how a suspension bridge holds its own weight better than my engineering major college boyfriend ever could. He just didn't have a piece of paper that said so. And to my family, that was the only thing that counted. We built a life. A small, ordinary, deeply happy life. Theo's welding business grew until he had a crew of his own. I got promoted to managing the billing department for a whole network of clinics. We bought a little house with a maple tree in the front yard. Margot played soccer and was bad at it and didn't care. We were fine. We were better than fine. And the absence of my parents became less of a wound and more of a scar, something I'd touch sometimes without flinching. I didn't see my mother again for 16 years. It was a Thursday in October. Margot was at practice. Theo was finishing a job across town, and I was in the kitchen reheating leftovers when the doorbell rang. I almost didn't answer it. We weren't expecting anyone. But it rang again, twice, with a kind of desperation, and when I opened the door, my mother was standing on my porch in a coat that was too thin for the weather, shaking, her face wet. I hadn't seen her age. That's the thing that hit me first, before any feeling. The woman in my memory was 48, sharp and lacquered, never a hair out of place. The woman on my porch was past 60, and she looked it, and more. She looked hollowed out. I didn't know where else to go, she said. And then, before I could speak, your father is sick. I let her in. I want to be clear that I almost didn't, that I stood there for a full 3 seconds with my hand on the door deciding whether to slam it, and that the only reason I didn't was Margot. I didn't want my daughter to come home and find me being cruel to an old woman on the porch, no matter what that old woman had done. So I let her in, and I made coffee, and my hands were shaking as much as hers. What she told me over the next hour rearranged everything I thought I understood. My father had been diagnosed 3 years earlier with a degenerative neurological condition, early onset, aggressive. He'd had to step down from the firm. And here was the part that made my coffee go cold in my hands. The firm hadn't been what we'd all believed. For years, my father had been quietly covering losses, making bad investments, borrowing against the house, against the future, against a reputation that turned out to be the only asset he had left. By the time he got sick, there was almost nothing. The Greenwich house was gone, sold to cover debts. They'd been living in a rented condo. The medical bills had finished what the bad investments started. My mother, who had never worked a day in her adult life, had taken a job at a department store fragrance counter at 61. We have nothing, she said, and I heard the echo of my own life in those words. The exact phrase my father had used like a weapon now turned on him. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to say I did, because it would make a cleaner story, but I didn't. I felt sick. I felt that strange vertigo you get when something you'd organized your whole inner world around suddenly tilts. "Why are you here, Mom?" I asked. Not unkindly, just tired. She couldn't look at me. And then she told me the rest. My father needed a specific expensive treatment, a clinical program that wasn't covered, that cost more than they could ever pull together. But that wasn't the only thing. There was a procedure that could help him significantly, and it required a living donor, a partial liver donation, from a blood relative. My father had no siblings left. His parents were long dead. I was, my mother said, his only child, his only match, most likely. She'd come to ask if I would be tested. I sat there in my own kitchen, in the house I'd built without a dime of their help, and I listened to my mother ask me to cut a piece of my own body out for the man who had erased me from his. I asked her to leave. Not angrily. I just couldn't have her in my house anymore that night. I told her I needed to think, that I would call her, and I walked her to the door, and when she got to the porch, she turned around and grabbed my hand, and she said the thing I'll never forget. She said the thing I'll never forget. She said, "He doesn't know I'm here. He told me not to come. He said he didn't deserve to ask." Then she left, and I sat on my kitchen floor and cried for an hour, and that's where Theo found me when he got home, in almost the same position he'd found me, 16 years earlier, with my mother's voicemail. He sat down on the floor next to me. He didn't tell me what to do. He never did. He just said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. You don't owe him anything, and you're allowed to give it anyway. Both of those things are true." I didn't sleep for 3 nights. I kept circling the same impossible questions. If I said no and he died, would I become the kind of person who let her father die out of spite? But if I said yes, was I rewarding the cruelty? Teaching some cosmic lesson that you can throw your child away and still get her liver when you need it? Margot, who I finally told because she's 16 and sharp and deserved the truth, had her own fury about it. He took your inheritance, she said. He's never met me. And now he wants part of your body? She was right. She was also 16 and didn't yet know that being right and being at peace are not the same thing. I went to see him. That was the decision I made before any other. Before testing, before yes or no, I needed to look at him. The condo was small and smelled like medicine. My mother let me in and then disappeared, deliberately giving us the room. My father was in a recliner by the window, a blanket over his legs, and the man who had once filled a doorway was small now, his hands trembling in his lap in a way he couldn't control. He looked at me for a long moment. I braced for the old contempt. It didn't come. His eyes filled, and he said my name, and then he said, "You shouldn't have come. Mom asked me to. I told her not to." His voice was thin. "I didn't want you to see me beg. I haven't earned the right to ask you for water, let alone." He stopped. He couldn't even say it. We sat in silence for a while. And then, because I had to, I asked him the question that had been burning in me for 16 years. Why? Why did you choose your idea of me over the actual me? He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something I'd never known. His own father, my grandfather, the founder of the firm, had been the son of a coal miner, had clawed his way up through scholarship and shame and a name he changed to sound less ethnic. And he had raised my father to believe that the family's position was a fragile thing, one generation thick, that could be lost in a single bad marriage, a single step backward toward the world they'd escaped. "I was so afraid of going back," my father said, "that I couldn't see you'd found something better than what we had. I looked at your husband and I saw my own father, the man I was raised to be ashamed of, and I punished you for it." He looked at his shaking hands. "I have spent 3 years getting sicker, and the only thing I think about is that I have a granddaughter I've never met, and it's nobody's fault but mine." I didn't forgive him in that room. I want to be honest about that. Forgiveness isn't a light switch. But something shifted. I got tested. I was a match. And here's the part that surprised me. The part that surprised everyone. I said I would do it, but on conditions, and I laid them out plainly. I would donate because I decided I didn't want to be someone who could have saved a life and chose not to, and because Theo was right that I could give freely what I didn't owe. But there would be no pretending. He would meet his granddaughter, and he would meet my husband, and he would shake the hand of the welder he'd spat on, and he would do it with respect, or he would do it not at all. And my mother would tell me the truth, the whole truth, about everything. No more cream-colored stationery. No more managing me. He met Theo 2 weeks before the surgery. I watched my father, this proud, broken man, extend a shaking hand to my husband, and I watched Theo take it gently in both of his, the way you'd hold something fragile. And I heard my father say, "Thank you for taking care of my daughter when I wouldn't." And Theo, who had every right to be cold, just said, "She took care of me too. That's how it works." Margot met her grandfather the same day. She'd planned to be frosty. She lasted about 4 minutes before he asked to see a picture of her soccer team and asked which one she was, and she pointed and he said, "You've got your mother's stubborn chin," and something in her face came undone. The surgery went well. Both of us recovered. My father got better, not cured. The condition is still there, but better. With time he wouldn't otherwise have had. He used some of that time to write Margot letters, one a week, telling her things about our family she'd never have known. The coal miner, the Portuguese great-great-grandmother, all of it braided together at last. He died 2 years later, peacefully, with my mother and me both in the room. The last thing he said to me, clear as anything in a voice that had mostly left him, was that Theo was the best man he'd ever underestimated. People ask me sometimes if I regret it, giving part of myself to a man who gave me nothing for 16 years. And I tell them the truth, which is that I didn't do it for him. I did it for me, for the woman I wanted to be able to look at in the mirror, and for the daughter who was watching to learn what you do when someone who hurt you finally falls. You can hold a boundary and still hold out your hand. You can refuse to forget and choose to forgive anyway. I learned that from a welder who never went to college, who knew more about how to hold a fractured thing together than 3 generations of lawyers ever did. For 16 years, I told myself the story had a simple villain and a simple victim, and it took my father shaking hands in that little condo to teach me how lazy that version was. Nothing that happened to my family came out of nowhere. My father didn't wake up cruel one morning. He was raised by a man who'd clawed his way out of a coal town and spent his whole life terrified of sliding back. And that fear got passed down like a family heirloom nobody asked for. When my father looked at Theo, he didn't see a good man. He saw the thing he'd been taught to be ashamed of. Cruelty almost always has a cause behind it, and understanding that cause didn't excuse him, but it did free me from carrying it as if it were about me. What I've come to believe is that the life Theo and I built didn't happen by luck. It happened because of 3 things I had to practice on purpose, over and over, when nobody was clapping. The first was simply choosing to do right, even when doing right cost me everything. I lost a trust fund and a family because I wouldn't pretend Theo was less than he was. That choice felt like ruin at 22. It turned out to be the foundation everything good was built on. The second was learning to see clearly, instead of seeing what I was raised to see. My parents had handed me a whole way of measuring people, by their diplomas and their parking spots and their last names, and it took years of watching Theo read library books at the kitchen table to understand how badly that ruler lied. Real wisdom, I've decided, isn't knowing a lot of facts. It's being willing to throw out a measurement that's wrong, even one you inherited, even one that's comfortable. And the third was the plain stubbornness to keep going. There were months we moved $30 between columns on a whiteboard and called it a win. There were nights I cried on the kitchen floor. I kept showing up anyway, to the billing job, to the budget, to the marriage, to Margot. That grit is what bought us the house with the maple tree, and it's the same grit that let me walk into my father's room and ask the hardest question of my life instead of running from it. When I finally gave him part of my liver, I didn't do it because the scales had balanced. They never will. I did it because I'd become someone strong enough to give freely, clear enough to know the difference between owing and choosing, and decent enough to want my daughter to watch me hold out my hand to a man who once threw me away. You can keep your boundaries and still refuse to let bitterness run your life. I learned that from a welder who fixed broken things for a living, and who, in the end, fixed something in all of us.